Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection and a sense of belonging, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we talk about sensitivity and the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. This is a great episode with Jeannette Folan, and in this episode, Jeannette talks about why she believes identity plays such an important role in the highly sensitive person's well-being. A few of the questions that I ask her are, how can we begin to understand our true identity? How does it benefit us to identify as a spiritual being having a human experience versus the other way around? And then she talks about what practices and activities can we incorporate into our everyday life to see through our spiritual lens. Some of the other things that we talk about is she talks about asking ourselves, who am I as an individual? She talks about what we need to do to be in the present moment. She talks about grounding, and she gives a really interesting example on how to gain perspective when it feels like things are really big in the moment. I really enjoyed this interview. As I say so many times, I just finished recording it. I'm still processing it. We had a really different perspective around a couple of things, and so just navigating that. I do want to give you a heads up that I think it's a great interview, and she talks about God, and I ask her, for people that don't resonate with the word God, they have another God that they worship. If people believe in a spiritual energy or spiritual presence, a feminine God, can we broaden the term so that if people have a resistance to the word God, they can get the message that you're talking about? And so she did make that shift, but I just want to give you a heads up that that's something that came up. And I think often when we have beliefs around things, we get so accustomed and familiar to talking about them that we forget that that may not resonate with everybody. And I really don't have a sense of where people are at spiritually as far as the listeners go. Let me tell you a little bit about Jeannette Folan. Jeannette Folan discovered she was a highly sensitive person in 2014. And after learning she was a highly sensitive person, she ended up publishing her first novel called Diary of a Teenage Empath, The Awakening. Since then, she's authored and co-authored several books and workbooks for children's, teens, and adults. In 2017, she became an integrative health coach and began leading a support group for HSPs in her community of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Along with her mentor, Wendy Nickerson, she developed her first ever accredited HSP certification training program for mental health professionals, which to date has been completed by professionals in 7 countries. There's a little bit of a longer bio in the show notes, so if you're interested in getting more information about that, please jump over to the show notes, and during the episode, I tell you where you can find those. If you're enjoying the podcast, you can really help me out by rating and reviewing the podcast. Again, in the show notes, I have instructions on how to do that. And now, on to the show. Hey, Jeannette, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Patricia.
I'm excited for our conversation today. I'm a little bit anxious because I'm afraid that I'm just not going to have the language to talk about it, but I tend to have fears and worries much higher than usually comes true, so we'll just see how it plays out.
Okay, let's try it.
So my first question I ask all my guests is, do you identify as a highly sensitive person?
Yes, I certainly do.
Great. And what do you think of the term highly sensitive person?
I think it's suitable, but I think there is a lot of confusion between highly sensitive person and the sensory processing disorder. Mm-hmm. So I do like that highly sensitive is what is used for the sensory processing sensitivity, whereas most people, they say that their child has a sensitivity disorder. I'm starting to see a little bit more separation now between it, which is good. I remember I was driving home to Chicago a couple years ago, and there was a huge billboard from the Autism Association, and it says, if your child is sensitive to their environment, then they they have autism. I mean, it was, I don't remember the exact words. It was almost so emphatic. It wasn't they may have, but it was, they have, they're on the autism spectrum. And I thought, wow, that kind of threw me for a loop. But I'm starting to see now a lot more people understand what being highly sensitive is from the clinical perspective. We still have a long way to go from the emotional perspective.
Sure, sure. Okay, I just want to dive right into our conversation. So, why do you believe identity plays such an important role in the highly sensitive person's well-being?
Yeah, that goes back to my childhood. That goes back to the last 7 years since finding out that I was highly sensitive. I think there are so many facets of identity, but it boils down to knowing who you are. And for myself, I recall as a child feeling the emotions of mom and dad and my siblings and mirroring them, not knowing that everybody wasn't doing the same thing as me, not knowing why I was so much more affected by it. So, sure, that happens from the time that we're born, right? Feeling the emotions of everyone around us and being changed by them. I know I was changed by them. I didn't know where I ended and the other person started. We all seemed like we were just one congruent family unit, and that kept on, of course, throughout my whole life. I felt like my emotions were never quite entirely my own. That was a big part of my identity, my emotions, my feelings, because from those feelings come our behavior, come our thoughts about ourselves and the world around us. It took me a long time to stop being that chameleon, and it happened so naturally. It wasn't something that I intended to do. I just wanted to blend in with the environment. It was truly innate, as I'm sure you yourself know how innate that is, to become that emotional chameleon with everyone around you.
Sure.
And in that, we get lost. We get lost. Who am I as an individual is not something that comes easily. And even when we do understand that we're a highly sensitive person and what that means, all that it involves, we still need to continue sifting and sorting through our feelings in an effort to claim something that's ours, as opposed to, the group of people I spent the afternoon with, or, my close, partner, or spouse. It's an ongoing battle, so to speak.
Sure. My experience is, and I think the distinction is, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, for children that grow up in environments where their parents are attuned to them, are able to respond to the deep feelings, the deep perceptions, the concerns, just the way that we naturally show up, I think those children learn to embrace and accept their feelings because their parents allow that. And I think that sense of identity is much stronger. I think for those of us that had parents that just didn't get us, didn't have the tools, didn't have the skills, whether it was intentional or unintentional, we're so adept at tuning into what others need and looking for the rules on the outside because, like you said, we're great emotional chameleons. And so we grow up into these adults that we kind of are very perceptive and know what everybody else needs, but learning how to take that focus internally and figure out, what do I need? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? And then knowing that how we're wired and how we show up in the world is really perfect and there's nothing wrong with us. That's the process that I see. Is that part of what I hear you saying, or are you coming from a different perspective?
No, that is quite what I'm saying. And sure, the earlier that you are allowed to and given the acceptance to be yourself, obviously, we have a lot less, fewer problems growing up, psychologically, emotionally, socially. For the highly sensitive people who grew up in that insecure environment and that insecure parental attachment. And certainly nobody's fault. I mean, I feel obviously there are some, cases, but for the majority, the parents certainly weren't educated and weren't equipped. We only discovered the highly sensitive trait in the 90s. So everybody before, and not that everyone understands it completely yet. Sure. I just think, though, that for those people who struggled with their identity, getting lost either in the emotions of the family or, you know, fine if they had a good supportive background, but then you still are going through the typical teenage struggles with identity when you go out in the world. And I have seen some very, very highly supported and accepted young people. I try and work with young people and parents of children. And I have seen them go out in the world and be bombarded with all the diverse emotions and, social issues that the teens normally face. So I think that the whole identity, the knowing who you are and accepting who you are and being able to define that by something that is stronger than what's going on around you. And I think that's just hugely important. It was for me
Sure, sure.
that not only grew up in an insecure environment, and that I believe is insecure parental or caregiving attachment, where they just did not feel 100% safe that they were going to be cared for and protected and not overwhelmed. That was the big one, is and that you're going to keep me from being overstimulated.
Sure.
So, which is why I strongly advocate for mental health professionals to get as much training on this as possible, because the other statistic is that 30 to 50% of clients seeking mental health support are highly sensitive.
I've heard that 50% of people in therapy are highly sensitive. And what I heard Dr. Aron say recently is she's thinking that highly sensitive people may make up as much as 30% of the population, where we previously thought it was 15 to 20%. So
I believe that's true. In fact, some years ago, I believe I wrote to her assistant, and I said, these statistics are from the 90s. I said, has there ever been any update on it? Because it seems like every other person I run into is highly sensitive. And of course, it was politely pointed out that I attract them, right? You just see yourself in a lot of other people. And of course, I started noticing then it's true. Everybody started looking like they had, HSP tattoos on their forehead or something. Oh, you must be highly sensitive. But I believe that's true. And I don't think that there was ever a miscount. I believe that there are more of us now, more of us waking up, if you will, to our sensitivity. I think that it's an evolution. I think it's evolving, just like humanity and evolves in a lot of other ways too. They say in a while we're not going to need our big toes or our little toes, our piggy toes. That one day a man is not going to have that anymore. They'll be born without them. So certainly we are evolving in so many different ways. But I got off the point, and I apologize for that. The identity issue for me primarily was because of growing up in that insecure environment, very, very beautiful family, but not aware of my sensitivity. And I was the baby in the family, and they were all very high drama people. And I think that I spent most of my life identifying only with them, even into adulthood, only with them. I remember distinctly saying, and when I was about 23 years old and I was getting my own place for the first time, I chose a place that was only a couple miles from their house. I said, see, you're never going to get rid of me. And it wasn't until finally I met my husband and moved to Canada. And they, of course, laughed and didn't want me to leave. But I identified with them so much that I didn't know who I was without them. It was only when I, as an adult, moved to another country did I finally start to explore who I was without them. And what I found out is that I was looking at my identity upside down, rather than, or I should say, like most of us, we look at the me, right? And we look at our parent sibling, and we look at who we are in relation to society and the rest of the world. And then we look at who we are in relation to God. If you believe in God, you say, well, who am I in relation to God? And God seems so far away from me. And it was something that being raised Catholic was kind of that unattainable relationship, or it wasn't a wholly symbiotic type of relationship. And when I turned that upside down and said, no, I identify with God first, and everything after that is secondary. It was a byproduct of the relationship with God. And that, to me, I mean, in that moment, it's as if I put on a completely different set of glasses and I looked at everybody and everything and every action. Every molecule in the world had a different color to me when I suddenly said, no, 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 my parents are certainly important, but the real relationship and the real identity that I have is the spiritual one.
I'm imagining if people are listening and they don't identify with God, they have whoever or whatever they worship as somebody or something called other than God, or they identify with nature or spirituality. Are you speaking specifically about God? What I'm imagining is people who don't resonate with God, as soon as they hear that, they're like, I'm done listening to this. And what I know is that what we're going to talk about has some really important things. And so I'm wondering if you're able to broaden that definition, or if you're literally speaking about just God.
No, certainly I'm speaking, for me, God is not what I was taught as a child. God is more of a collective. So if God is not a word that resonates with you, or even spirituality, that's okay. It all represents, for me, this collective that is this much bigger picture than just me as an individual. So going back to my journey of identity, when I used to think of myself as just one human, an individual person trying to figure out how I fit in and related to everybody else and everything else. And in that state, in that mindset, I was reactive instead of being creative or proactive. I felt very unsure of what was going to happen. I'm not even necessarily unsure of myself, but just unsure of what life was going to bring me. And then uncertain of yes, how I was going to be able to handle it. And I often felt like the victim. I felt like everything happened to me. But when I started seeing myself as being one valuable part of this whole force of nature, humanity, there's something magical going on, because going back to Einstein's theory of one atom spinning in this direction over here and change the direction, and another atom, clear across the room, start spinning the other way as well. So all being related, all being connected, this energy, if God is not a good word, then energy might even be another word that you choose. But as soon as I felt and accepted a part of this energy, then everything changed around. Then it was this beautiful creativity, and I felt confident. I felt more like the hero instead of the victim, and that things were happening not just for me, but also because of me. And that's probably the biggest aha moment that I had, where it wasn't just a mental aha moment, or let me explore this a little bit. I mean, it happened in a flash, that as soon as that mindset changed, everything around me started changing. And even the most stressful things that are happening in the world don't really get to me like they did before. I think the first question to ask is, who am I? If you look around and see yourself and other people, then to question whether or not that is coming from your highly sensitive nature. I think that one of the biggest underlying struggles that we have is this feeling that we are not separate, because I can feel you, and I sense so many other things about you that most other people don't. And when that happens, it takes a little practice, but if you sit with yourself and really, really become aware of every fiber of your being, if you will, and then introduce some other energy. How does that other energy change and how do you change? And I I spent quite a while in trying to get myself out of a depression. And I fortunately was able to, I was self-employed, so I could work from home. I could make my own hours. I could, have those off days wholly to myself. And during that time, I just kept experimenting really with how do I feel again as a whole person. And I started thinking about or engaging in different important relationships in my life. And I started noticing how I felt as a result. So it is a lot of body work, really paying attention to what's happening inside. And of course, highly sensitive people have such a great enteric system anyway. Um, we feel what's happening inside of our bodies. And then, of course, it was the mind, a lot of mind body connection work to really own every single cell in my body. I know that was a long answer to your brief question, but it was figuring out how I could own every single part of me. And when I knew it well enough, it became very easy to discern when somebody else was affecting me. It felt foreign then to have that other person. And I could then begin to allow it to happen or not allow. If I wanted to feel, I could feel. If I didn't want to feel, I just politely, let it pass on by.
Well, I'm just processing on a bunch of levels right now. What I'm hearing is that inability to differentiate. And you said this, where do I stop and where do you begin? And taking on energy and emotions from other people that weren't yours. And when you said that people have that feeling that we're not separate, my guess is that if your orientation is where you have that difficulty of knowing where you stop and where somebody else begins, that may be true where my experience and the people that I seem to be drawn to or that are drawn to me tend to have that feeling of feeling very separate and not seeing where that connection and that commonality is. If their gremlins are about, I don't fit in, I'm too much, I'm not enough, I don't matter. So as you're talking, I'm trying to filter this in and put it into a framework that makes sense for me. So I'm not sure how to respond other than by just sharing what I just did, but I'm in this place where I'm trying to try on what you're saying because it's a different perspective than what I'm accustomed to working with.
Well, Patricia, have you ever felt like you were turning yourself into a brick wall because you didn't want to experience whatever this person was coming at you with?
I think the language that I use is different, and we're kind of not talking about it, but maybe we need to. It feels like a lot of what you're talking about is things that empaths experience, that taking on energy and emotions that aren't their own. So is that part of what we're talking about?
I think that empaths and highly sensitive people are perhaps a lot more alike than many have defined. As a highly sensitive person, and I tend to work more with highly sensitive teens and young adults, and sometimes they say that they do identify as being an empath and sometimes they don't. I've I have found that whether someone identifies with being an HSP or an empath, they still have that same ability, if you will, to shut down their feelings, their system of emotions, especially when it relates to people who are close to them. And I think that it's that shutting off that they do, that we do, or the just opening up, and letting the floodgates, of emotions come out. That's like part of the exercise that I was kind of referring to in terms of learning how to really get that ownership of who you are is in the noticing of when you go inward and when you block other people out versus when you allow yourself to be open to them. You might say energetically, I say emotion. I use a lot of these words interchangeably, and I'm sorry if that's kind of throwing you off in this case, but I think it has to. Energy and emotions are really one and the same.
Yeah, and my guess is as I'm just trying to be alert of what's going on. For me, it was not safe to be in my body. And so I live very much from the neck up. And although I've done some body work and healing, my whole approach to things is very much in my head. And so part of what our communication bump may be is that I work from the neck up and you're talking about body work, which is not where my strength is. I do some. And so that also may be where, we're just having a little bit of a dissonance, not a bad thing, but just naming what's going on.
Just, expanding in all different ways if we can. I would ask you, so when you said that you kind of dissociated from your body, you didn't want to live in your body and you lived from the neck up, what was your physical experience like? Were you often during that time fatigued, or were you sick often, or what was that experience like?
Tons of somatic. I had stomach aches. I didn't want to go to school. I felt really overwhelmed. I felt like I couldn't cope. I couldn't deal. And in my family of origin, we did not talk about feelings. And if I had to cry, I had to go to my room, but it was okay to use words to talk about things, but not talk about feelings. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I needed to survive. And food was a huge part of how I managed things that felt overwhelming. I mean, food helped me to survive.
I can understand that. I hope my mother isn't listening to this. Forgive me, but she was such a horrible cook that I did not fall back on food. Oh, goodness. But I, like you, also had the stomach aches, and then that evolved into migraines, and that evolved into, ulcers and all kinds of things. And I think that it really is an understanding, going back even to identity and saying, knowing who I am. Well, I am my body, and I am my brain. I am my emotions. I am my energy. I'm all of this. So for highly sensitive people, when they do go into that, dissociating, not wanting to be in their body, or just shutting down that emotional system, mm-hmm. That's when the health issues start to creep in. And that's when we find, that we don't feel we have any control over anything. And that's why breath work is so important, because we can control our breathing. And every little step that you take up that ladder, for me, getting out of depression was feeling like I didn't have any control over my feelings when I woke up in the morning. And if I took a couple steps forward down the same path I had taken the day before and the day before and the day before, by the end of the day, I had ended up really deep in the well. So I knew that I had to just do one thing that I could control. For me, that was breathing. I would sit, I would take a very specific amount of breath, and then I would begin to move my body. I have control over moving my arm in this direction, or I have control over blinking my eyes. And it sounds silly, but literally to claim my body as the one thing that I could control is what started getting me out of the depression, because I couldn't get a handle on those emotions and on my thoughts even. But just taking that step to connect to my body and really call that mine and who I am. I am Jeannette. I am this body. That was a fantastic part.
That sounds really powerful.
Just a quick exercise that I recommend to kids when they wake up in the morning to get grounded, to get in their body wholly, is to start naming things that they see in their room. So their eyes open, they say, "Oh, hello, ceiling fan." Or they look over to the side and they say, "Hello, nightlight," and hello, and to identify all of those things, because that puts you in the present moment. That puts you, your thoughts aren't drifting somewhere else when you're saying hello to the ceiling fan. So that's just a good exercise.
I like that. How does it benefit us to identify as a spiritual being having a human experience versus the other way around?
Certainly for me, that was, as I described, that shift of feeling like I had a very, when I say power, I mean that in the best sense. I mean a strength. I mean, more compassion. I could come from a position of being the helper instead of needing the help, or of being the whole person, if you will, instead of the broken, or the person that was in pieces. And I, I think that, again, I know your audience perhaps might not resonate with the God and the spirituality, but when I put on those glasses, when I put on the spiritual God, or just the collective, we are all one, we are all part of this amazing dynamic energy system, I started seeing other people much more like myself. Not even compassion, I just started seeing other people as this beautiful energy system, all of their own, having unique experiences. But when it comes right down to it, we in fact are 99.9% the same. I mean, science has shown we are 99.9% the same. And that fact, that number really came to life when I saw myself from the other end of the telescope as a spiritual being having a human experience, and not the other way around.
What I was thinking is, developmentally, as children, everything is focused around the child. And so if the child gets mad and something bad happens to the parent, the child has said, I wish something bad happened. They think they're magical. They have that sense of they're omnipotent and everything is really about them, which developmentally is appropriate. And as we grow and mature and we realize that we're separate, we have, my thoughts and feelings can't control or make magical things happen to other people. And we get that larger sense of the collective. That's part of what I'm imagining as I'm hearing you talk about this. And I think too, that when we have that strong sense of responsibility and being so conscientious as highly sensitive people, and because we show up in such a committed and loyal way, that it really can be so freeing when we know that there's something bigger than us in the universe that kind of has a hand in everything. And like you're saying, that I'm a human being having, I'm going to say it wrong, a spiritual being having a human experience, that it's not about my body. It's not about any of these things, that connecting on a spiritual level, that there is a sense of connection and oneness. And it really takes that sense of individual control, in quotes, into a larger collective, can be so freeing.
It absolutely is freeing. If you just look at some of the big events that have happened in the world, and you see where, when they happen, we begin to act as one. And not, our separate actions, we begin to see how they affect everybody. I don't know if it's a statistic, but I know it's a beautiful saying that when a butterfly flaps its wings at one end of the world, it changes something at the other end of the world. And I believe that to be true. I believe that children feel that way. They feel that. I don't mean necessarily the responsibility when they say, I hope something bad happens to you, and it does. But I mean, they feel their omnipresence because they have it. It is there in them, and they are exploring that. They're expressing it, and they, children are really so much smarter than we are when it comes to nature. I can tell you that my little genie self, when I was a girl, was so smart. I went to the tree when I wasn't feeling well, and I would lean up against with my bare arms, or I would lean up against a tree, and I would talk to the tree, and it would heal me. I would literally feel better from having connected with nature. Now, we look back at, I was watching a movie on YouTube called Grounded, and truly about how these people in Alaska discovered that if they walked on the earth in their bare feet, and one guy even buried himself naked to get over his back pain. But if they did that on a regular basis, grounding with the energy of the earth is very healing. And this was done by the native cultures, decades and centuries ago. So I think we're coming full circle on a lot of the ahas, on a lot of the realizations of how we really are a collective energy. And I think that I have a question for you, actually.
Sure.
When you were little, did you do you feel that you were smarter? Do you feel that you had a better sense of what the world was really all about, as opposed to as you got older?
Talking about Untamed, and it really resonated with me of how we get conditioned to be tamed, and we really want to get back in touch with that wild spirit. And I think I really had that wild spirit, and she's becoming incredibly conditioned. So that's my roundabout way of answering your question. So yeah.
What do you think that your child self would have told your current self to get out of the conditioning?
My child self talking to my adult self now.
Yes.
Well, I feel like the things that I, that tamed me it was for survival. So it kept me alive in my circumstances. But yeah, I think to be able to let that stuff go and to really get back to that wild part. I don't know. This is I just was thinking about this today, and it was actually a pretty painful realization to hear. And so I haven't spent a lot of time processing it. How about you? I guess I'd like to ask you.
But yes, you just described something I hadn't even thought of in myself. And I hadn't asked that question to myself, and just telling the story to you about being a smarter child than I am an adult made me think of that. But what you just said is beautiful, because we need to accept that what we did, that taming, that shutting part of ourselves down, was for survival. Thank goodness we did that. Thank goodness we had that either innate ability or learned skill to do that. And now we can say, okay, that doesn't serve us anymore. That isn't serving us anymore. So let's be thankful that we were able to go through that, come out the other side of that. We had the tools, we developed the tools, or found the tools that we needed to do that, which was part of that conditioning and taming process. And now we're smart enough. We've woken up enough to realize that isn't necessary anymore. And I think that's great. Thank you for sharing that, because I just feel woohoo 10 pounds lighter.
Sure. And my experience is that it's a process that whatever behaviors kept us alive, we often will default back to those behaviors under times of stress and duress. And to have radical self-compassion. And often what happens with mindfulness is we're watching ourselves continue to engage in behaviors that we know don't serve our highest good. And they still revisit us. And for us to just have an amazing amount of self-compassion when we find ourselves doing those things, and just observing, I'm doing this thing again, or I'm not doing this thing that I know would make me feel better. And I'm just going to have to learn to be okay with it, because we step in and out. Sometimes those things disappear because we are getting our needs met on a higher level. And then other times with stresses or things that come up, we go back to those things, and just learning to really have a tremendous amount of self-compassion for those behaviors, because they're survival. It's what we do. It's basic survival instinct.
I find too that I've been through exactly what you just described, going in and out, falling back into the negative patterns that don't serve. For me, I was not able to not even express compassion. I felt that after a while, it was almost like, whoa, maybe this is actually just a habit that's been now wired into my brain. And how do I unwire that? Because I almost felt like it was an autopilot, like it was just the knee-jerk reaction. And I had to go and get help for that. There was nothing that, yes, all the compassion in the world, that you fell back into this again. But compassion I had, but the tools and skills to really stop and let go of that. I'm not saying I've done it to everything, but I mean, to a couple particular areas, I had to go and seek support for that. And I think that that's something that a lot of HSPs need to consider, because it for me, I always hesitated to go into a counseling scenario, because once I was there, it was fine. It was like dragging me to a party. Once I was there, I had a great time and everything. But I always just imagined it going on and on and on for years. And suddenly I'd be digging up things I didn't really intend to, and finding out things that I didn't want to. And instead, I made a point of just telling said therapist that this is what I want to achieve. Dig as deep as we need to achieve this, but no more. Like this is, I'm only coming here. And my goodness, sometimes, it would be 8 sessions and I'd just be like, wow, woohoo, that, check, got that one off my list. So, and then when I was ready to go back, if something else came up, I would. But I think that the relationship with therapists, I always just had in my head that it was one way. And in fact, and like I didn't have any control over it, like it was going to take over me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that certainly isn't the case, especially nowadays.
Yeah. And I really think that if you have a good relationship with a coach or a therapist, that you're co-creating the process with them. And I've had clients who have said, I only want to work on this kind of light stuff. It takes me a while to build trust, and this is all I want to work on. And I think that's great. I had a client recently who's having more panic attacks than normal due to some stressors. And so they didn't want to meet. And we talked about, let's meet and find some ways to connect that are not talking about heavy, intense things. Let's connect over some other things, because I think that our tendency is to want to withdraw and isolate when we're struggling. And that's often when we need connection even more. And so finding ways that we can connect that may not on the surface appear to be, quote, therapeutic, but are incredibly therapeutic, because it's about holding space for people exactly where they're at and meeting them where they're at.
I couldn't agree more. My therapist did something like that with me. The last therapist that I had here in Halifax some years ago, coming out of my depression. And it was what I really felt, it was so authentic, is that, I thought that it was going to suddenly be small talk and whatnot, but it was so authentic. And so, there's a real gift for therapists and counselors who are able to make somebody feel that safe, especially a highly sensitive person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think oftentimes it's great when therapists have skills. We want skilled, qualified therapists, but I think so much of the healing comes from the actual relationship and modeling. How do you show up authentically, vulnerably, obviously appropriately? But I think the success of therapy is often about the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the client.
It is. And the thing that I would recommend from my own experience is, if you are a highly sensitive person who has those spiritual thoughts, who has those feelings about God or wants to explore that, to not be afraid to bring it up, even if you don't think that your therapist goes there, even if you don't think that you most likely don't know what their beliefs are, but that doesn't in fact matter. I found that sometimes speaking to somebody who's at the other end of the scale is even more helpful. So my therapist was not highly sensitive. My therapist did not believe in God. And yet we had some of the best conversations about it. And I almost felt even more able to express myself, because they didn't have any experience with what I was talking about. So there was almost like the no judgment.
Interesting.
I mean, of course, therapists tend not to be judgmental anyway. They don't make you feel judged, but really, in fact, it was, the person almost was more curious and fascinated, because they didn't have these conversations with their family members or their loved ones, because they too, were most likely not spiritual. It was a wonderful experience.
That's great. And you could even talk to a therapist about it. I mean, if somebody asked me, I think I'd want to know where they were coming from, only so that I could meet them where they needed me to be. But I worked in a hospital for 9 years. I worked home health for 5 years. So I dealt with a lot of unexpected death, terminal illness, people that were at the end of their life with hospice. And I would often ask, like, what are your beliefs about what happens, why people get sick, what happens after you die, to get a sense of what their frame of reference was so that I could meet them in that place without imposing my views on them. And generally, people really enjoy talking about what their beliefs are and how they see the world and how they make sense of bad things that happen, quote, bad things. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so getting back to the identity issue, I just wanted to mention a couple things. That being that if you are questioning, as I did, who I am, and you try on a few different hats, some of the questions that I journaled and put in one of my books is the following. Who am I to God? And again, you can change out God for the collective or, the universe. Who am I to God? And then who is God to me? Who is the universe to me? What effect does God or the universe have in my relationship with myself? And then flip that. What effect does God or the universe have in my relationship with others? And those questions took me over 2 years to to really dig through. So it certainly isn't a small or a slow process, but it was through that a lot of the healing happened for me as a highly sensitive person.
Yeah. And if my experience is that if you did not have a great relationship with your parents, and if your orientation, this is very stereotypical, what I'm going to say, so I don't have the ability in the moment to try and make it not as stereotypical. What's coming to mind is if you had a bad relationship with your father and what you were raised with is God is a man, and we think of God in terms of our father, and we did not have a loving, embracing father, then we may have problems with the idea of something bigger than ourselves. It's benevolent and all loving and all accepting. And so if that's the case for you, then there may be some healing and repair work to do, or to figure out what your ideas of parenting and someone bigger than yourself are in order to work through that healing, in order to really understand that people that are bigger than us, that have power over us, are not all controlling or whatever we may have experienced. I feel like I'm being incredibly messy with my words, but that's the best way that I can express myself.
No, I understand exactly what you're going through. Everything that we were taught as a child, whether it be about God, whether it be about why the sky is blue. I mean, it is the foundation of our belief system. And that was another big challenge that I had is I didn't even almost know what to believe in, because once I put on those other glasses, once I started looking at the world through the other end of the telescope, everything, all of my beliefs were thrown out the window. And I was on very unsteady ground for a while, but then I started to, regain my balance and see that I can still be here and experience the world as a human being, but still have the knowledge and the vision or the perspective of being able to see it, through the God lens or through, this universal lens. One of the fun things that I did when I was having a really, really bad day, and I always try and come up with fun, silly things to do, which translated over into a really great children's activity book for highly sensitive people. Essentially, everything in the book is something I experimented with on myself. One of which is go onto Google World and find your house. It's slightly different than Google Maps, but find your house and zoom in on your house using the satellite view and see yourself there in the house. See yourself at the computer. See yourself with every problem and every worry and every, you know, ill feeling that you have, whether it's coming from you or you're picking it up from other people, and just be in that precise moment. Then very slowly roll out the view, zoom out till you see your street. And give a cursory glance over all your neighbors' houses that you know, and imagine those people there in those houses. And then do the same thing. Oh, now here's my village. Look, there's the guy down at the gas station who pumps my gas, or there's the woman down, so you imagine all these people. And you keep going and you keep going and you keep going. And the beautiful thing about the Google Earth is that you can go all the way out of our solar system. And it is such a strange feeling because as you go out in, of course you have to stay focused, stay present in the moment, do the work, don't let your mind wander, be wholly present there. But as you do that, you can sometimes literally feel yourself moving away from your problem and almost taking on this big perspective of it, that it is just a grain of sand in a desert.
Yeah.
And I have had an emotional shift on that. Any number of times I'll go back to using that one. So that's just the different perspective I'm talking about. It is seeing things in a completely different, different lens.
I love that you're literally taking a different perspective and reminding yourself that you really are just one small speck in the universe.
We're all stardust.
Yep. I'm looking at time and we're needing to shift a little bit. Is there anything else about this that you want to say that I haven't asked you about?
So much to share. No, I think we've covered quite a bit. Thank you.
Okay. What are some of your superpowers being a highly sensitive person?
Creativity. From the time I was a child, the artistry came out. I could describe the rainbow in 2 words or 2,000 words. I write music. I paint. I do everything creative. And I know that none of that would be possible if it weren't for being a highly sensitive person.
Wow. What would you want to tell your younger self about being a highly sensitive person?
Don't you change one thing. Don't listen to them when they tell you to change. Just stay yourself, because boy, did I find magic in the world. I had a magical, magical childhood, even though I grew up in a house where there was quite a bit of stress and, financial situation. And there was just, it didn't matter. It didn't matter. Me and my imagination and the the world around me, the wind alone, the sky, the clouds, the sun, every blade of grass, everything seemed like a miracle to me. And I would tell my little self, please don't let that go and start, following. Don't be a sheep and start following everybody else into the materialistic world.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel really grateful. We went to the library every Saturday, and I think we were allowed to check out 10 or 11 books. I was an avid reader. My mom really fostered creativity, and she sewed and was very social, and we did baking. And for as many times as I talk about, my deprived childhood, I don't think that I give as much credit to my mom for really the ways that she nurtured some really important parts of who I am.
I'm so happy to hear that we start to really see our parents for who they were when we begin to accept ourselves even more. I I was living here, and so this was in the last 7 years, and I felt the need to ask my mom something very important, and that is to essentially give me something that I didn't get a lot of as a child, and that was face to face praise. She would tell everybody else, the neighbors, her hairdresser, the grandparents, she would always be talking about us behind our backs in the good way. I mean, she was praising us, but never looking me in the face and saying, that was the most beautiful song I ever heard, or whatever, or that's such a beautiful picture. It was just always, going out and bragging to everybody else about us. And so I got her on the phone one day and I said, I'm going to ask you a very strange question. And I expressed what I felt. And I thought that what she was going to do was just kind of, not laugh it off, but dismiss it. I thought, oh, of course, I think you're wonderful, that type of a thing. Oh no, Patricia, let me tell you something. She went on for over an hour. And I wept and wept and wept. I had no idea. She had no idea that she had done that. And when I asked her point blank, I really, really would like to hear from you, what it is that you think makes me so special. is your child. Oh, holy cow. And our relationship has changed a lot after that, as you can imagine. It's just getting choked up about it now. It's just beautiful. She couldn't stop gushing, and it was honest, authentic gushing. And she remembered so many things that I had done that I had even forgotten about, that she still holds in her memory as being special because you're my child.
What a beautiful gift that you gave to yourself by asking her.
It's crazy sometimes that we get what we ask for, huh?
Yeah. What I'm imagining is if you're listening right now and either your parents are no longer alive, you don't have contact with them, you had a very bad relationship, you never met maybe your biological mother or father, and this is something that you're wanting, and if you're feeling pain right now, that this is something that you feel like you're not able to experience, what I would really encourage you to do is to sit down and do some writing and imagine the loving parent that you didn't have, and to write down what it is that that little person inside of you is longing to hear. That it's amazing when we can get this from somebody else, but ultimately when we do our healing work, we also want to be able to provide that from within. And so if for some reason in your life you're not able to ask somebody to get that, see if you can cultivate that. And because inside, that little person knows exactly what he or she needs to hear, or they need to hear. And so I really would encourage you to, if you felt pain when you were hearing Jeannette talk, that this is something that you can give to yourself. And if you do have a parent that you think can do this, or somebody who's close to you, or a partner, and you're feeling that longing, take a risk, and hopefully the person will be able to meet you where they're at. And if they can't, that's okay. That we can still give ourselves those messages that we need.
Excellent advice.
Jeannette, where can people find you? What resources do you have to offer? Tell everybody where they can find you.
The website is empathdiary.com. And on that website, you'll find all kinds of tools and resources for highly sensitive people and empaths. Mostly, I want to point out that if you are a mental health professional, Dr. Wendy Nickerson of the Nickerson Institute and I developed a training program specifically for mental health professionals who work with highly sensitive people. It is 10 hours, and it is approved for continuing education hours by many of the North American organizations.
Oh, that sounds great. And have you written some books also?
I have. I've written a handful of books, mostly the teen novel. It's called Diary of a Teenage Empath, The Awakening. It's a very dramatic novel that incorporates, much like parents put vegetables into spaghetti sauce for their kids, I incorporated a bunch of educational, emotional support resources and tools for highly sensitive people. And then I have a children's activity book, Discovering the Power of Sensitivity, and a handful of what I call pocket guides, which are just 20, 30 pages on a particular subject, including a morning wake-up routine. One of the exercises I described in that is for kids to look around and name everything in the room. So all kinds of little guides like that. And then there's an online training program as well for identity and relationships.
Sounds great. And so everybody can find this at your website?
empathdiary.com.
Great. And I will have links to that in the show notes. If you go to unapologeticallysensitive.com, click on this episode with Jeannette Folan, and in the show notes at the very bottom will be links to where you can find Jeannette. Jeannette, is there anything else before we go?
I just want to say thank you so very much for having me, Patricia. This has been really great talking to you.
Well, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Hey again. I'm curious to know how that landed with you. After we stopped recording, Jeannette really hadn't thought about how people may have been impacted by her talking about asking her mom to give her compliments. So I also am curious if that was activating for anybody, if anybody's planning on going out and asking somebody for some feedback about what their parent appreciated about them or a partner. If you want to reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com, if you have any feedback about that, please let me know. I want people to speak freely on the podcast. I'm always thinking about the listener and how people may be impacted by what they hear. So I'm curious, how was that for you? I'm not sure when you're going to be hearing this episode. I'm not sure if the new run of online courses for HSPs will have launched or will be launching. If you heard anything that resonated with you, if you feel like you've got some healing to do, some exploring, you've been looking for a coach or a therapist and you're not sure that you want to work with somebody, I work online with people all over the world globally. I offer a free 20-minute consultation. At this point, when I'm recording, I have a few spots open. I would love to talk to you, see if you're interested, if there's anything I can do to help you out. You can go to my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com, and everything you need to know about me is there, including links to all of my social media handles. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're feeling some peace in this time in the world, whatever's going on. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.